Thank you very much for that introduction. I have to add that I'm also an English teacher. My main claim to fame, although most of my teaching has been in state school, the state school system in Israel. I've done a little bit of university teaching, mostly, as I say, for younger learners, but an English teacher is an English teacher is an English teacher, and I hope that we have things that we can share. I have to say thank you first very much to Didem and the team here at Bilgi University for inviting me. I always love coming to Turkey, and this was a lovely opportunity. And thank you also to Cambridge University Press for making it possible for me to come. At the beginning of this day, you were thanked for getting up in the morning and coming to a conference instead of taking the day off, and I have to say thank you for staying to the end of the day and to this talk. I'm not going to be talking about technology or the future. I'm going to talk mainly about the present. I have no pictures, I'm afraid, so I hope you can cope with this presentation. Anyway, so what I'm talking about is I'm going to very much pick up on what Didem said in her introductory few words at the beginning of today about the post-method era and why we're there, what it means, and then specifically I'm going to be talking about the PPP process, presentation, practice, production. How many of you, before this, you saw this title, knew what PPP was? Most of you, good. Okay, it's fine. So I just wanted to check. Okay, so in this talk, I'll just say more or less what I'll be covering. And please feel free to raise your hands and interrupt and ask me questions or make comments during the talk rather than waiting till the end, because if you wait till the end, you might forget what you wanted to say. So I'll keep my eye on you. If I see a hand raised, I'll stop. The topics of the talk, first of all, I'm going to say what I understand by what method is and therefore what post-method is in English language teaching. I'll be talking about PPP and specifically the arguments for, the arguments against. I'm picking up a particular issue within PP which has come in for a lot of criticism, the transfer from practice. You practice something and does it or does it not transfer to production? And finally draw some conclusions. So that's the plan. So let's start off with method and post-method. What is a language teaching method? I'm going to give you the definition that I'm going to be using for this presentation. There have been various definitions in the past, but the definition we shall be using for this presentation is a method is a specified set of classroom procedures which is based on a coherent set of learning or teaching principles, which in their turn are based on theories of what language is and what it is and how it is learned. So if we look, for example, at grammar translation, that's based on the principle that you teach language by teaching facts about the language. You teach words and you teach grammatical structures and then you practice them, and that's how you learn, because language is a collection of words and grammar. That's what language is, and that's how you learn it. Audiolingualism, on the other hand, says that language is a set of patterns which you learn by constant repetition and successful performance, and it's very much based on behaviorism, sort of stimulus response. You do something, you get a reward, you do it again, and it becomes a habit. So language is a set of patterns. Language is essentially a set of habits which you have to learn, get used to doing. You don't explain grammar, you just give examples, and students produce them, imitate them, drill them until they get good at them. An interesting point of similarity between grammar translation and audiolingualism, which is very often seen as opposites one of the other. They're not actually completely opposites because both of them place essential value on getting it right, having good grammar. They're both based on grammar very much, and getting the grammar right. Whereas the third method that I'm going to mention here moves away from them completely. Task-based instruction is based on the communicative approach, which says, no, grammar is not so important. the underlying principle is that language is not a collection of words, a collection of structure, a collection of habits, but language is communication. And therefore, if you're going to learn language well, you need to communicate. And task-based instruction says instead of having grammar exercises, vocabulary teaching, vocabulary review, pronunciation drills and so on in our English lessons, what we need to do mainly is have tasks which get students to interact with one another, very often based on group or pair work, get them to interact with one another in some way that replicates real-life communication. So most of the procedures then in task-based instruction are communicative tasks. So by the definition I gave earlier, task-based instruction is also a method. Okay, so that's where we're coming from. That's what method is, and now I'm going to talk about non-method or post-method. There's been problems with the concept of method which have been pointed out by quite a lot of writers in the 1990s and 2000s. First of all, a particular method may not fit a local context or the needs of the learners. It may not fit the local culture. It may not fit the personality of the teacher. It may not fit the way the teacher sees learning taking place, and it may not fit upcoming exams. There are all sorts of reasons why a particular methodology may not suit. And the outstanding example today is task-based instruction, which, and there have been a couple of research articles on this, does not fit, for example, the Asian context. Hong Kong or China doesn't fit. I'm not quite sure how far it fits Turkey or even Israel. It's the various problems with all these things. A particular method may not suit the local context. That's the bottom line here. Similarly, grammar translation doesn't fit the needs of a group who really want to learn English for spoken conversation, and so on and so on. No one method is suitable for a particular context. The second problem is that if you're saying you ought to be teaching like this, these are the procedures you should be using because this is what language is and so on, that takes away from the teacher the right to choose what procedures he or she will use. If you're teaching, teachers, for example, in Turkey are being taught in their preparatory courses that they should be teaching communicatively using lots of communicative activities, that means that the teacher, if the teacher wants to do a very structured grammar exercise, he or she may or may not do it, but you might feel a bit guilty about it because that's not what you've been taught how to do, not what you've been told is the right way to do it. So telling the teacher you should be teaching according to this methodology or this method disempowers the teacher, takes away from the teacher the right, which I think is the right of any professional, the right to decide how best to teach my teachers in my class. And it may lead to the rejection of useful teaching learning tools. I mentioned in one of the sessions earlier, I don't remember who said this, the phenomenon of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So you get, for example, grammar translation used a lot of translation. A lot of the exercises, I was taught French through grammar translation many, many years ago. In the 1950s in England, and a lot of our exercises were translating from French into English or from English into French, and very little of the lesson was actually conducted in French. And one of the results of that was audiolingualism, which completely rejected the use of L1, and since then, there has been a tendency to say, well, grammar translation used translation, so we shouldn't use translation. It's a bad thing to do. And actually, translation is quite useful in certain circumstances, and certainly use of L1 is useful, as one of the sessions earlier today pointed out. Code switching is used and is found to be useful. But it was condemned for many years because it was associated with grammar translation, which was rejected. So that's an example, and that there are other examples as well as well of really, really useful procedures being thrown out because they're associated with that method, which is not our method. A final problem, which was mentioned by Gordon, I think, as a problem also with the technology, that it comes to be seen as a goal in itself rather than as a means to an end. So if our main goal in teaching our students is that they should learn English, and that is our goal, that is the overriding goal, and we've got to keep that in mind all along. What tends to happen in the literature is the implication that we should be teaching according to this methodology. The methodology, the method, becomes the goal instead of the main goal being teaching our students or getting our students to learn. Our goal is not to teach communicatively. Our goal is that our students should learn to communicate, and that's something quite different. Learning to communicate, you may learn through all sorts of very learning-rich activities, not all of which may themselves be communicative. I'll come to that later. So, if we're into, or are we, all these criticisms, so people have been saying, okay, throw out methods, we're in the post-method era. And Kumravard de Velo, I never know how to pronounce his name properly, I hope I succeeded, suggested that, in a very famous article, that we are in the post-method era and we should replace method by a set of macro strategies, such as do procedures that will facilitate language learning, or teach language in context, things like that, general things rather than a methodology, which was an important step because what he was saying, let's throw out the conventional methods, the ones I've mentioned, and go for more overriding principles. The problem with his macro strategies is that some of them actually suffer from some of the problems of methods. For example, one of the macro strategies I mentioned was teach language in context. Teach language in context, okay, you can teach language in context, it's a useful general principle. There are also places where you want to teach out of context. You might want to teach a particular expression or a particular word, take it out of context, teach it. And to tell the teacher you should be teaching according to these macro strategies suffers from the same problem as some of the methods in disempowering the teachers, telling the teacher you should be teaching like this. I don't think, and this is a basic belief of mine, I don't think you should be telling the teacher you should be teaching like this, you should be using this particular strategy. You should be telling the teacher, teach in a way that will get your students to learn, and probably your judgment is the best judgment as to how best they will do it. So we're coming to a stage where, in principle, a lot of writers have been saying, let's reject method, take it out of the equation, and go for post-method. Prabhu, in a seminal article, 1990, one of my heroes, Prabhu, said there is no best method, and he suggested something called the teacher's sense of plausibility, which is very, very near to what I think about the teacher being the one to decide as a substitute for method. So what I'm saying is I'm not sure that it's even an era. Possibly the idea that there is one right or best method of language teaching is unacceptable and always has been and always will be. It's not just a question of present era. This is where we're at, in my view. But paradoxically, although I'm saying this, methods are in fact alive and kicking in the literature. If you read any article or any set of articles in a particular language teaching journal like TESOL Quarterly or ELT Journal or any one of the well-known teachers' journals, you will find lots and lots of references to things like task-based instruction, task-based language teaching, or other methodologies, methods which are recommended. Waters pointed out in 2012 in an article, the concept of method is still deeply rooted in present thinking, present writing. He talks it Methodism, you know, the faith of Methodism. There is a best method which we should be adopting. And task-based language teaching is widely recommended. It's even, sometimes I've found it used in a sense which suggests that it is axiomatic. You don't even need to argue for it anymore. Of course, we should be teaching through task-based instruction, and you move on from there. Well, I don't accept that. I think that task-based instruction is, like any other method, not acceptable as a recommended best method. The recommended best method is the one that the teacher decides on him or herself. And so what I've suggested, I'll give you the reference in a moment. I forgot to say at the beginning of this talk that you don't need to take notes. Most of you are not taking notes anyway because you're tired, but anyway, you don't need to take notes because I'm leaving this presentation with Dido. In fact, I've already given it to her. And the details of all the bibliographical references are also on the final slide of this. So if you want to get it, you can download it from the university website. What I'm suggesting instead of one of the accepted methods is a situated methodology, which is based on what the teacher decides to use in his or her teaching situation, where the overriding principle, as I said before, is effective language learning. So, whatever leads to good language learning by my students should be part of my methodology. If you want to read more, I've written an article about it, which I've referenced here. On to presentation, practice, production. Well, I'm just going to move away. I'll come back to post method in a moment. I'll bring them together, just moving away to a different topic now. Just to recap what they mean, presentation is explaining or presenting a language point, which is normally taken to be grammar, but which could equally well be a word or expression or even a phoneme. Practice, the students then practice it in focused exercises, and production, the students use it in their own output, whether this is written or spoken. Reasons to use it. I'm going to give the for and against, okay? First of all, a lot of teachers feel it helps. It makes sense, and a lot of teachers feel that it brings about learning. Secondly, there is actual research to show that it's the basis of most course books, most English course books. Even though they may officially subscribe to a communicative approach, there's a lot of PPP within the textbooks. On a theoretical level, it makes sense in terms of skill theory, although PPP was going very strong before anybody sort of thought about or wrote about skill theory, but nevertheless, the two come together very neatly. Skill theory has three stages, basically. Skill theory relates to any skill that you learn, whether it's driving, or playing a musical instrument, or playing chess, or indeed speaking a language. And it divides into three stages, essentially. The declarative stage, where, let's take driving, for example. The instructor says to you, make sure the car's in neutral, put the key in the switch, turn the key, put your foot on the clutch, and so on and so on. And it actually says what you have to do, describes the action. You then go on to proceduralization, where you as the learner put those instructions into action. You do that, and you do it lots and lots and lots and lots of times until you find that you can do it automatically. And you don't need the instructor to say, put the key in the integration, put your foot on the clutch. You do it automatically. And you may even forget what the instructor originally said. You may not be able to recall his or her words. You just go ahead and do it. It's in your hands and feet. It's automatic. And what you just think is, I've got to drive, and you get in the car and drive. In terms of PPP, the declarative is presentation. So I tell the students, this grammatical structure works like this, or this word means this. I actually tell them. They then practice the grammar or the words lots and lots of times until, hopefully, ideally, it becomes automatic and they can produce it in their own production without thinking about it. Okay? I've given the reasons why we should use it. And now there's lots and lots of arguments in the literature why we shouldn't. It's outdated. Anything which is old is bad. Well, I don't, I sort of take personal offense at that, because beyond a certain sell-by date, you shouldn't be using it anymore. I don't think outdated is an argument, but it is very often used. You find outdated used in the literature as if it meant bad. Okay? Discredited, same sort of thing. Who has discredited it? This is a discredited process. Who is discredited? By whom is it discredited? Why is it discredited? It's discredited because the person writing thinks it is. That's all. There's no actual scientific or research or evidence that it has been discredited. Has failed in bringing about learning. You'll find this as well. Again, where's your evidence? A lot of people, including many of the people sitting in this hall today, have learned very nicely according to PPP. Thank you very much. It's helped a lot of learners. Some it has not helped. But the point is that we have no evidence one way or the other. We don't know. There's been no actual serious empirical research to show that particular methodologies have produced better or worse learning. Certainly there's no evidence that PPP does not teach. It's a question of where you stand on the theoretical and practical level. It prescribes a rigid order of procedures. You present, and then you practice, and then you produce, although, of course, you can, in fact, vary these. And finally, and I think this is the only reasonable, convincing argument which I've come across of all of these, that practice does not transfer to production, which is very often true. We've all had this experience, I think, of practicing something, and the students do the exercises beautifully, get them all right, and then the next day they make the same mistake in their own speaking or writing. There's a very serious sense in which practice does not necessarily transfer to production, although it sometimes does. Sometimes does, but sometimes doesn't. And what can we do about this? And I'm going to spend a little time looking at this particular point because I think it's a key one. And I spent a lot of time sort of agonizing about this in my own teaching. How can I get grammar practice to transform into communicative production where students get the grammar right? Why do my gap fills and multiple choice and matching exercises not work? Why do they still make mistakes, and what can I do about it? And my agonizing and my experimenting eventually resulted in a book, which some of you may know, called Grammar Practice Activities, but I'll tell you how it fits in a moment. So from practice production then, I want to spend a few minutes, I said, talking about this particular issue. How am I doing for time? Fine. Before I do that, I need to stop and ask, nobody's asking any questions. Would anyone like to say something? Give me a break for a moment. Yes.
You're pushing practice all the time.
Yeah.
That should lead to more production versus a small amount of practice. Is there
Yes. The sheer amount of practice, I'm saying. I'm going to make the point in a moment that it's actually a continuum. It's not a sort of a dividing line between one or the other. I think, in a sense, I'm practicing English at the moment, right? As soon as you're using English or you're using a target language, you're practicing it, and therefore the division line is rather difficult to define. But yes, it's partly a matter of sheer quantity of practice. Just a slight digression at the moment. I don't know if any of you have read a book by Malcolm Gladwell called Outliers. Anyone read it? Outliers. Download it and read it, or on your Kindles, or buy it. It's really a nice book. But he's talking about expertise. and he says that in order to become expert in anything, any skill, we're talking about sort of chess playing or playing an instrument or speaking a language or anything, you need something of the order of 10,000 hours of practice, which is an enormous amount. It works out as something like 3 hours a day for 10 years or something like that. It's an enormous amount, and it applies to anything. And he makes a very good case for it, and he brings all sorts of examples of different kinds of experts in different areas, very attractive. But then what I did after I'd read that book is I went to look up the literature, the research literature on expertise, and actually it bears out this theory that it is a matter of thousands of hours of practice, that if you want to be really good at something, okay, you need to be talented and you need to be enthusiastic, you need to be motivated, but crucially, you need an enormous number of hours of practice. And you work out, how does a native speaker learn sometimes complex grammar of their own language so well? And the answer is that they've had thousands of hours of practice, from small children up to middle-sized children. Right? So they've had a lot of practice. Anyway, so yes, it's a question of amount of practice very largely, which means that one of the reasons why practice does not transfer to production is that we simply don't have enough classroom time to do the amount of practice they need. They need to make it up outside by reading or by talking or by listening to English movies. Are movies dubbed in Turkey, or are they subtitled? If they're subtitled, you're lucky. If they're dubbed, then you're deprived of a lot of English input. Anything else anyone would like to bring up at this point? Yes?
Something. It also depends on how the presentation is being done and then what kind of practice to do.
What kind of practice? That's it. It depends on what kind of practice. And I think this is...
Personalized.
Yes?
The structures and somehow students cannot relate the language
Yes.
to their lives.
Yes. Partly personalization is part of it. They can't relate it to their lives. I'm going to pick that up and add 1 or 2 points, but that's very, very important. From practice to production. Practice that focuses on accuracy does not usually transfer well to situations where the learner is focusing on meaning. Let's look at a conventional grammar exercise here. Lena cannot find her keys. She has lost them. Present perfect. Danny is very happy. He has won the race. They don't live here anymore. They have moved. What you're focusing on here is not making meanings. Arguably, you could probably do this without understanding all the words. You are focusing on getting the sentence right. And as long as you're focusing on getting the sentence right, all your attention is on getting it right, not on meanings. As soon as you go out of that and you need to make a sentence about something that's happened, you're thinking about the meaning that you want, something about you want to say about something that's happened, and you have no attention to spare for looking at getting the grammar right. And it's a question of attention. It's a question of division of attention. Where is my attention going? And can I, when I'm actually trying to convey something, can I also focus on getting it right? And that's the problem. That's why Krashen, for example, said that this kind of practice is useless because it only practices getting it right and it doesn't transfer to what he calls acquisition. I don't agree. I don't think this can't transfer, but I think we need to do something to help it transfer. It won't do so on its own. There's a sort of gap, a chasm between getting it right and communicating ideas. And what we need to do is find a way of bridging that gap and getting students used to the idea that they can practice getting the grammar right at the same time as thinking about meanings. Provide activities that give learners practice in creating meanings while keeping an eye on correct forms. And what I'm suggesting is a process where we gradually move from form-focused to meaning-focused to communicative in grammar practice. For example, let's look at the present perfect again. So we've done our very, very form-focused exercise in the previous one I showed you, and we're just concentrating on getting it right. How about this one? Very, very controlled, isn't it? All they can say is, have you met anyone famous? And all the person can answer is, yes, I have, or no, I haven't. So it's very controlled, very rigid, but you cannot do it without understanding. There's no way someone can answer whether or not they've met someone famous unless they understand what the question was. So we're moving here away from form-focused exercises where you don't need to know the meaning to an exercise where you do need to know the meaning, but the exercise is scaffolded in such a way that you have to get it right, and you get it right making meaningful sentences, but you're still not creating meanings. So this is only the first step. Let's take another step. Here's an example. Okay. Free sentence completion, but scaffolded partly. Not completely as the previous one, but partly. For example, write a sentence about yourself and share with a neighbor. I am proud of the fact that I regret that I have never. Okay, 1 minute, just to share with a neighbor. You don't have to write it down, just say it. I am proud of the fact that I regret that I have never. With a partner. Give me a break now, do it. Introduce yourself to a partner first if you haven't met them yet. Can I have an example from someone of one of the sentences? Yes, please. I am proud of the fact that I have met her. Anyone else? Let's go for the proud one. I'm going to stand here and wait till someone raises their hand, so if you want to go home today. Yes? I'm proud of the fact that I have attended this meeting. Okay, nice, thank you. Right, yes? For? 2 years. I'm proud of the fact that I've been working here for 2 years. I once gave this talk, or a similar talk, and I did a similar exercise in Brazil at a time when Brazil was in a depression. And one of the teachers raised her hand and said, I'm proud of the fact that I've kept my job. Very, very sad. Anyway, okay. So what was happening here was you were making a sentence which was very, very scaffolded. If you take the construction, I have plus the third form of the verb, I made you a present of the I have bit, and all you had to do was supply your own third form of the verb, but it had to be meaningful and personalized. Okay, so we're into your personalization here. So we've got here the mix between focusing on form, because it has to be present perfect, there's no way you can use any other tense, but it is also making your own personal meaning and conveying it to a neighbor. One interesting thing about this particular one is that the first one, I'm proud of the fact that I have. You notice I had to stop you doing this, because what happened was that after you said the first sentence, I have done it, you started telling each other about the circumstances in which this thing has happened. and then it very often goes into the past tense. I'm proud of the fact that I have done something. Oh, yes, when did it happen? What did you do? And you move into the past tense. That's just by the way. And it's a nice way of contrasting present perfect and past. Examples: I'm proud of the fact that I've just got my first job. I regret that I have never learned Chinese. Free sentence construction. Here, I am giving this instruction. And again, I'm going to ask you to do it very briefly. But what I say to a class is, I want you to say what has just happened, like this, for example. What has just happened to produce the given response? And the sentence has to be in the present perfect. In other words, I'm telling them, this is a grammar practice activity. I'm frankly practicing grammar here, but I want you to think of a sentence which has meaning because it's producing this kind of reaction. Can someone please, can you all, think of a sentence that produces one of these four answers, and just say the sentence without saying what the reaction was, and we have to guess what it was. Do you see what I mean? So I say, for example, I've passed the test. You guess, congratulations. Anybody? A sentence in the present perfect. Yes, please. Sorry? You have found a husband at last. What was it meant to be? What had you thought of? What? What a relief, yes. Someone said, what a surprise. Another one? One more. My freezer broke down. Oh, no. Very often when you get the responses here, students will call out a totally inappropriate response, like, I found a husband at last. What a surprise. And the rest of the class laughs, which immediately tells you that they've understood. Yeah. So that's quite useful, and it develops very nicely. And a development of this for homework is write me another 6 sentences, and I have to guess which exclamation you were thinking of. So that's a sort of puzzle for the teacher. But they are composing complete sentences. They may not be personalized, but they are meaningful because they're based on a response they're going to get. And they are using the target language. So what they have here is a division of attention between, yes, I have to do present perfect, has to be right, but I also have to make a meaning. Moving on to a communicative task where I probably at this point will not say use the present perfect, but I'll give a task that's very likely to produce it. You can see the example here. What happens when they do this, this exercise is that they also use a whole lot of other verb forms. Not only have you ever or have you done something, but also can you something or do you ever something. So what you're seeing here is the present perfect contextualized within a situation that uses it, but which also uses other forms as well. And their attention is almost entirely on creating meanings rather than getting the language right. And hopefully at this point you've got to the point of production where if you've been through all sorts of other exercises like the ones I suggested, they should have the grammatical feature sufficiently under control, sufficiently automated so they can use it easily in this situation. But not always. there's no such thing as practice makes perfect. I'm not claiming that practice makes perfect. All I'm claiming is that practice helps, that it is a useful thing to do, that if we use practice particularly in the way I'm suggesting here with some meaning-focused exercises, not just the conventional drills, gap fills, matching and so on, that it will contribute, it will make it much more likely that they will in fact express themselves correctly when they get to produce their own output. So what I'm saying is the practice stage needs to include activities that invite meaning-focused and creative responses as well as form-focused predetermined ones. Notice incidentally, just occurred to me as I'm speaking, that this links up with what Herbert was saying in the morning about emotions, because the creative, personal ones also involve the emotions. They're not just intellectual exercises putting bits of sentences together. And as I said earlier in answer to an earlier question, the move from practice to production is a continuum. So you start off with your very form-focused, get-it-right exercises, and you become more and more communicative until you get to the last exercise I suggested, the interview exercise, which looks to all intents and purposes like a communicative task. So a continuum, not a jump. So I'm going to summarize now and bring it together with what I said earlier about the post-method era. What is the place of PPP in the post-method era? So firstly, in a post-method era, teachers should not have to adopt a particular method and should not feel under any compulsion to adopt a particular method, even if it's fashionable, recommended, and so on and so on. Should feel free to select those procedures that in their view and particular context will help their students to learn well. PPP is an example of a useful sequence of procedures that is likely to promote learning in most teaching situations and therefore is likely to form part of most teachers' repertoire of procedures within their own selected pedagogy or methodology. So it's one component of an overall pedagogy that includes also many other components, particularly communicative tasks, extensive reading, and so on and so on and so on. So it's one component. An important proviso is that it is likely to be used more or less, or possibly not at all, depending on the local teaching context and the teacher's decision. If, for example, you have a class of very, very advanced speakers of English, as I have at the moment, as it happens, I'm teaching a group of faculty, a group of researchers in my college who want to publish their research, their original research in academic journals and do presentations at international conferences. And their English is very good, but it needs to be a bit better, and it needs to be academic. And so I give them classes to improve their academic English. But the basic grammar and vocabulary they've got, I don't use PPP very much with this class. I would, on the whole, use tasks or do reading sessions or discussion work and so on. I would not use PPP very much. But on the other hand, when I was teaching elementary school, or I was teaching beginner classes, I used it a lot, because it helped them at the beginning stages work up a repertoire of useful vocabulary pattern, grammatical patterns and vocabulary. Finally, and this is what I was explaining in the last part of my talk, PPP is most effectively used when the practice component includes meaningful, creative review activities as well as conventional accuracy-focused exercises. Thank you very much for your attention.